ready for it. We are live. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, depending upon where you are in the world. It's quite bizarre, to be honest. We had a live stream. This is a colloquial name for a show that we say is Two Liberals and a Marxist, though in reality, that isn't really necessarily just the case. My name is Piotr. I am the host of Piotr Curzon Geopolitics, or the Global Gambit. I'm joined here by Professor Michael Rossi and Professor James Kalinzi, both of whom I'm sure are well known to their respective audiences. We're streaming across YouTube, Substack, and X. And if you want to leave your comments, they will be on the bottom right corner of your screen. So you can see what people are saying. You can join us in real time. If you want questions to be seen, then maybe send a super chat, or we'll be monitoring as we talk, and some of us listen or disagree, depending upon it. But we had a live stream a few days ago about developments in Iran, but also sort of the past year. And 2026, I think many of us assumed would begin with some remarkable developments, maybe the first major geopolitical one being Iran. Yes, and then Operation Resolute Absolute happened, or Absolute Resolute, whichever way it is. What has happened in Venezuela, which will be the primary focus of this stream, is nothing short of unbelievable, extraordinary, remarkable, illegal, depending upon the type of words you want to use. And what we're going to do is break down what has occurred, what is happening right now, where Michael is, which is in New York, with President Maduro there currently facing well, whatever these charges are. And then what might happen next. But I wanted to just take a moment to actually look at what happened, because I personally was walking home. I'm on the same time zone as Michael at around 1:30 a.m. And I like to join X. I like to join X to listen to some live audio chats, and just sort of, it's my idea of late night entertainment. Call me weird. And I joined it about 20 minutes before the operation began. And we saw these rumblings. We began to hear from the OSINT community, or open source, that aircraft were moving, that naval assets in the sort of northern shores of Venezuela were moving. And then by 2 a.m., we had a combination of pre-strike shaping, as it's known in the military, which is basically when the United States began to target cyber and electronic sites, specifically Venezuela's radar, comms, and command links. This was then followed by a huge influx at around 2:15 of Chinook aircraft, and what the military personnel at the address yesterday said were a combination of F-18s, F-35s, but also Apache helicopters. So you saw at least 5 targets being struck, from airports to ports to other critical and military infrastructure. This was to isolate the airspace and completely overwhelm, and as we soon came to realize, distract from the real operation, which was the insertion, special ops of Delta Force flying in to and around Maduro's main presidential quarters. And then within around 3:30, well, he was gone. He had been extracted. The point is, this entire raid lasted less than 90 minutes and demonstrated that there is no other military, and this is not an endorsement, it is simply a pure acknowledgement, that no other military, not even China's, could operate such a mission as we saw done by the United States. Now we have a situation where the president was taken onto USS Juris, or whatever it was called, I forget the name, and he was then transported to Guantanamo Bay, where he was then flown out to New York, and we saw the astonishing photos of him in, well, technically, which is a war crime. It is illegal under the UN Charter to take media pictures and usage of a POW, of a prisoner of war. But we shall come to that. James, Michael, thank you for letting me to lay the ground there, because I found it just incredible to covering it in real time. Where do we begin with this? What did you think when you woke up? I suppose is the best question for both of you.
Well, I'll start off by saying that I have to give credit to the Trump regime for doing this before January 5th, which is the official return to work. January 5th is the official circle back in January day, and he did this over the weekend. So I was kind of hoping for a nice quiet weekend before the year actually began. But suddenly, here we are, 2-3 days into 2026, and we have our first attempt at regime change, and just really throwing the gauntlet down for what the rest of the year is going to probably present us. As always, I agree much more than I disagree with either of you, James, especially here. So I think that, first I should do is just start out by saying just New Year instead of Happy New Year, just New Year. This is quite ominous. This is, as you pointed out, more than illegal, but it is the Trump regime effectively saying to much of Latin America, the Monroe Doctrine is back. In fact, at one point, Trump even giddily recalled it the Donroe Doctrine. And this is effectively the United States telling everybody south of the Rio Grande, comply or face the potential consequences.
I would differ with you on one point, which is that I think it's more of a leadership change than a regime change, but we can come to that. James,
yes. I think very good point.
Attempted regime change. We need to emphasize this.
So my time zone is a little different from yours. I mean, it was much later in the sort of the day. Well, it was sort of late morning when the news came out, and I just. I was certainly shocked by it. Look, first thing I'm going to say is, for the avoidance of any doubt, I am not going to shed a tear for Maduro for one moment. He led an unbelievably brutal and repressive regime in Venezuela. He ran the country's economy down. We have seen millions flee the country as a result of it. But, and it's a huge but, I absolutely agree, this was absolutely and completely illegal. And I think it is highly damaging and dangerous for the United States and the West as a whole. And I know we will discuss all of this, but I as I say, I just look. It sort of came as a surprise, but it didn't. We knew that something was being planned, and I had done a video a few weeks ago on my channel where I sort of discussed this idea of regime change. Say, look, there is a very long and dishonorable history of this in the United States, of a number of regime changes. We've seen Iraq was a very important example, and again, I'd like to circle back to Iraq because I think it's incredibly important for what we're discussing now about, what is the US planning to do now that Trump's sort of saying that the US is going to run Venezuela. But Piotr, I think you hit on a very important point on that. What exactly does regime change look like, or is this just leadership change? But we have this whole history of regime change. The question was, how was it going to be done? The most obvious parallel with this is Noriega. Yes. And it was actually sort of pretty much 30 years, if I remember rightly, it was 30 years to the day essentially that the United States have overthrown Manuel Noriega. And for those sort of watching in the audience who are old enough to remember how that was done. But that was a much bigger build-up, and we knew that was coming. I mean, there was all sorts of, there was a much greater military presence on the ground. There was, those shots of helicopters with the blaring music out and everything like that. This was suddenly sort of out of the blue, but we knew that something had been planned. We just weren't quite sure what it was. There'd been a lot of speculation that it was going to be assassination, but in this case, it was more like that sort of bin Laden operation. Well, no, because that ended up with being dead, but, flying in, taking him to compound, snatching Maduro, and then sort of taking him out the country. And as you say, putting him on charges. I don't know if any of you have seen the indictment. They've unsealed it, but it is quite remarkable. So he sort of talks about cocaine trafficking, and then sort of possession of machine guns. which as one wit I saw on Blue Sky. By the way, I don't touch X. I've come off it. I won't have anything to do with that horrible site. But as one wit on Blue Sky pointed out, most Republicans would sort of have carrying machine guns as a badge of honor.
There was by the Constitution. I saw on X as well, which basically said sort of, so what if Maduro's what if we failed to trial Maduro? So what happens? We let him go and just sort of dump him on the shores of Venezuela and pretend nothing happened. Like,
well, I mean, again,
which is not going to happen. But I did want to jump in on the leadership regime change because, to be honest, James, I differ a little. I mean, we saw this coming. Something was going to happen.
Yes, I mean, it was quite clear that something was being planned. It just wasn't. Was it going to be a full-scale invasion? That was always a horribly risky enterprise. But even if there was a lot of opposition to Maduro, you don't want to do that. I mean, this in many ways makes no sense. It's impossible
to do that anyway. You can't undertake a military operation of that scale and type.
No. I mean, this wasn't Grenada. Remembering, of course, Grenada is another example of regime change. That was a small Caribbean island. Caused all sorts of ruckus, by the way. I mean, the Grenada operation, for anyone who can remember.
I mean, look, the scale and size that would have required to undertake a proper amphibious landing.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it was always highly unlikely. The question was,
possible resistance force, including if the Venezuelans had.
Look, Piotr, I know it wasn't. It was never likely to be an invasion.
Always going to be.
There were lots of scenarios for how it could be done. And
I think we should do a better job of like understanding the details there, because I think they practiced this for months. There was a full-scale building built. This is what the British did in SAS with Operation Nimrod in 1980 against the Iranian embassy. They built a specific building of the British embassy. I'm sure you know this, James, and would practice and practice and practice. And then one day the conditions were perfect and they just went in. And that's exactly what the Americans did this time. But I do want to just buckle down on the leadership regime change thing, because I think this is crucial for what happens next. And this is why I want to defer to both of you who maybe have more ideas about that. But for me, it's not as simple as nation building. Venezuela isn't as bad as Afghanistan. It's not a poor state like that. The education of the population is pretty decent. The infrastructure existing is pretty high. It's got remnants of a time when it was a pretty wealthy country, right? But you now have multiple factions in Maduro's government who are going to be vying for power, but also you've got this opposition. And now you've basically got an administrator of Marco Rubio who wants to run the entire country as some kind of satellite state, as a literal client. So how is this power dynamic going to work, do you think?
Well, I mean, what I can say is that as far as Venezuelan politics before Hugo Chavez's United Socialist Party of Venezuela came to power, is that it was regarded within the U.S. State Department as one of the more successful democracies within Latin America. But we have to take that with a significant grain of salt. And I think that there is just a very brief history background that the viewers could benefit from about this. And that is that prior to Chavez coming to power in 1998, Venezuela was considered to be, as I said, comparatively speaking, a successful electoral democracy. There were two political parties that dominated the Venezuelan political scene. The first one is, or was, Acción Democrática, and the other one was this long name, this Comité de Organización Política Electoral Independiente. Okay, so it's like, the Committee for the Political Organization of Electoral Independence, AD and COPE. Doesn't matter which side of the political aisle that they were on. One was in power, one was voted out, the other one came in. Both of them were regarded as, at least traditionally speaking, mid-range political parties. Both were corporatist, both were pro-free market, and both ran the country as a rentier state. And for those also that are not familiar with this, a rentier state is a country which almost exclusively economically relies on the revenue generated from the exportation of one raw material, right? So we're talking about oil. The reason why Venezuela was regarded as a successful democracy is because you had electoral changeover, but the country was pro-Washington. It was pro-West, it was pro-corporate, and this is effectively what the United States ultimately looks at Venezuela and almost every other country south of the Rio Grande. Not in terms of political rights and civil liberties, but in terms of economic compliance to major U.S. corporations. When Chavez came to power in 1998, this is 2 years after, some of you may remember, oil prices dipped significantly in 1996, 1997. I remember I was just out of high school and the price of gas went under $1. I was amazed at how, prices never go down, they go up. This is where rentier states who rely on the revenue from these raw materials start to economically hemorrhage. And what's also important to note about Venezuelan politics is that, yes, it was considered, as you rightfully pointed out, Piotr, it was considered to be prosperous for those that lived in the urban centers, for those that were part of the major industrial corporation economic sectors. But it left a lot of the countryside, the rural populations, off the electoral grid. This is where Chavez was able to capitalize on social discontent and, to a large degree, elements of populism. When he comes in, and this is very much the same repeated story that happens in many of the world's developing countries, he does the one thing that the West cannot suffer, absolutely cannot suffer, and that is nationalize the energy sector. This happened in Iran in the 1950s. This happened with Venezuela in the 1990s. And if there's one thing the United States cannot stand in Latin America, it is a political official and a political party effectively denying America unrestricted access to either its energy, its agriculture, whatever it happens to be. And it plays very well into the reason why Trump has been repeatedly saying that Venezuela, Maduro, Chavez stole American oil. Now, I don't know how you steal American oil on your own soil, but this plays into this understanding that ever since Chavez came to power, the American industry, the American oil industries have effectively been denied. Say what you want about Chavez, say even more what you want about Maduro. I'm not going to disagree that he was unpopular among many sectors in Venezuela, but Trump's attempt at effectively abducting Venezuela's leadership and then making it very clear to Delcy Rodriguez, who is the vice president of Venezuela, who was sworn in as interim president. So yes, there is no regime change per se. The Maduro government is still in power, but it is a warning. Comply with us, or we can very well reinvade the country. End of story.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out that the situation in Venezuela has simply just shifted hands. It isn't like you've got a complete and utter rejection. What I find interesting is that a lot of Venezuelans are celebrating this, but there's a lot of also concern about the broader ramifications. I was reading one article in the Financial Times earlier, and it was emphasizing that sort of of the actors who have the ability to actually enter Venezuela and take over the oil or manage the sort of economic business aspects. Chevron is really the only one that has that at the moment, with about 3,000 potential workers. But there are plenty of other businesses and plenty of other groups that are not so sure they want to get involved. This is what I wanted to share, actually. Just wanted to share my screen for a second to sort of complement what you were saying, Michael, because if you look at the statistics of Venezuela's crude oil reserves, as we know, if you follow this sort of thing from economics, Venezuela has by far the most amount of crude oil reserves. China's been in there for years. And obviously, I see this as a grand strategic move by the Trump administration to also squeeze China. or to limit also the role that Russia and Iran, or OPEC more broadly, have over oil distribution.
Yes.
This graph here demonstrates what you were talking about, how oil production shot up under Chavez, and it became 15% of the world's oil supply. And then this one was the last one. Now, America did buy under Chavez quite a lot of oil until Trump came in and lambasted the government with sanctions, which caused obviously their production or intake to completely crumble. And this was the point I was making, that Chevron is well placed. But there's a lot of doubt amongst the private sectors about actually moving in Venezuela, and that's only going to get worse because you've got this power struggle between now the government, the opposition, and the US administration itself. So, James, I'm sure you've got lots to say.
Well, look, we're going to debate exactly what all this was about. I think there is the argument that this was oil, but this just reminds me, it's all very, very reminiscent of the debates that we were seeing at the start of the 2000s over Iraq and what was going on there. I suspect that it was more just about, all right, oil certainly will play a part in this. We know that Venezuela is incredibly important in that regard. But I think this is also about the United States firmly, stamping its authority over the Americas. We know, as you'd mentioned, that this was about the Monroe Doctrine, that Trump definitely sees the world in terms of, spheres of influence. And that is obviously incredibly worrying for Europe. If Trump sort of sees, has come up with some sort of real or imagined deal with Putin, that you do what you do, in Ukraine and over Europe, whatever you can get. But I will have full and absolute control over the Americas. I think what was very interesting is that, this, and we'll probably come back to it and talk about a bit more, but, this certainly doesn't seem to be the end of the story. I mean, there was just some footage of Rubio, who effectively will, be in charge of whatever the United States is going to do in Venezuela next, being asked very, very pointedly about whether Cuba would be next, and refusing to rule it out and saying they are in a lot of trouble. So is this something that they could be seriously considering? But I think, the point that we came to earlier about you can remove the senior people in these situations, but what do you do then to change the government? And this is where boots on the ground in a place like Iraq, boots on the ground in a place like Afghanistan was absolutely vital for doing that. Because you kidnap Maduro, you can't, from a distance, just completely replace that whole regime. You've got to somehow do this. And it looks like already the first indications are, by handing it over to the vice president, who seems to be sort of very much behind Maduro, at least sort of calling for him to be returned, how compliant she's going to be in all of this. But essentially, is this shaping up to be a compliant regime, just a continuation? You do the symbolic thing of getting rid of Maduro, saying to Venezuela, saying to the Americas, look, this is what we can do if we really want to. You fall into line with us, and we will let you continue. And I think as it was very interesting. I mean, I wonder what Machado's making of all of this at the moment, because where does she fall into this? I mean, the US is saying that it's about, democratic elections, but they refuse to be drawn on when that will be. And it's going to be very difficult. Are they going to keep going in time after time and just arresting the next leader? If they don't call elections, this really opens up all sorts of questions as well about exactly how they see this as playing out.
I need to mention, Maria Corina Machado's 15 minutes of fame were up around minute 7 or 8. That was it. Trump had already said she's not respected. She was already thrown under the bus. She was
mentioned by the Trump address at the end during the conversation. And yeah, Michael, you said it exactly. I think he didn't want her involved at all, because she got the Peace Prize, for one. He's that petty. I wouldn't put it past him. But second, also because she because she wasn't in the country. And I don't think they have any intention of actually installing Gonzalez, the actual winner of the election in 2024. So I don't know. I wouldn't discount the election opposition entirely. But clearly right now, the Trump administration wants to see this as administering Venezuela, right? I use the term satellite state specifically.
The way that I see this, and I can't, this is clearly in no way, shape, or form a one-to-one comparison here at all. Let me just emphasize that. But I couldn't help but wonder whether or not we are in between that very brief period between Turkey's first invasion of Cyprus and the second invasion. The second invasion was the one that ultimately sealed the deal in controlling the top third of the island. And so the way that I say this is that, no, I don't see this as a form of territorial colonialism, but we are effectively having this conversation in between a very precise and surgical military operation that abducted Maduro, but left the United Socialist Party of Venezuela still in power. So for Trump saying that we're going to take over the country until we feel it's appropriate to hand it over to somebody, either means one of two things. One, he's just mentioning whatever comes to his mind. And number two, there is there's an additional plan of action that has not yet been realized.
I don't think so. From my military analysis or what I've seen from the military movements, I think the US is largely done on that front. I think this is more moving into political and technocratic management at this point. They are going to just basically administer Venezuela as an extension of the US, mainly through the private sectors. As I said, Chevron is going to be leading the way. But this does lead me to another thing that I wanted to emphasize, which I haven't seen many people consider, which is 2.5 years ago, or just over 2 years ago, Venezuela was putting a lot of pressure on Guyana over Essequibo, the big jungle territory that they claim is part of sort of a greater Venezuela. But there was obviously pushback by the United States, Biden administration, and so on. But this is because you have the Shellbrook shelf, if you like, which is a incredibly large oil deposit that was discovered by ExxonMobil in 2015. And then they realized by 2019 that it had the potential to be the biggest single, I think, in recent decades. And as of 2024, Guyana's economic growth for that year had been 44%. Compare that to sort of China, which is at like 5 to 6. So the point I'm making is that this doesn't just stop at Venezuela. We could damn well see the Americans trying to link up these two countries. You could see a bit of a tension between them and Guyana. Guyana is much more sort of, US aligned, if you like, because it's a British colony or former, but also just because they don't have any military capacity at all. The point is, though, it doesn't stop here. And we could see the Americans really trying to extract as much as they can from the oil fields and deposits or whatever around this part of North and South America. My main consideration is what the Brazilians and the Colombians would do, or say, if anything. Probably not much, but the Colombian government was the first to come out and criticize Trump's actions. And just to some comments I saw in the bottom right, yes, the UN is having an emergency meeting tomorrow, but emergency in the UN means about 3 to 5 business days. Because they're not going to meet until working day, which is Monday in this case. So anyway, I'm sure you guys have some thoughts on plenty of that.
Well, of course, I mean, the UN, it won't go anywhere. For the very obvious reasons. Obviously, the UN, the United States is a permanent member, and so as we see in these situations, it will just, any hope of getting any sort of action. I mean, not just we always think in terms of resolutions, but you can have things like presidential statements. None of that will come out. I mean, the very best you can hope for is some sort of muted sort of reaction that, everyone hopes that Venezuela will remain calm and stable and go in a particular direction. I think, that would be the very, very most optimistic outcome in all of this that we could see. But no, I mean, Piotr, you're right. I mean, there are far bigger elements of all of this. And you pointed out the fact that in the past couple of years, Venezuela had been very, very hawkish towards Guyana, claiming 2/3 of its territory, saying this was a legacy of Spanish colonialism. It was denied it. It was the perfidious Albion had stolen it from Venezuela, and it was taking it back and producing these new maps and everything like that. I mean, one would hope that that's gone now, but definitely it's very, very difficult to see. And Michael, I think your point about that interesting Cyprus comparison, I think is very apt. We have seen that first step. There's statements that the United States is going to run Venezuela, but we just really don't know what that means, considering that you've still got a leadership which is supposedly very hostile to the United States. Is it going to turn around? What exactly is it going to be? How compliant is it going to be? And what can the United States do if it does decide to put up resistance? But I suspect that the United States has made its show of force, and whoever it is who's going to be running Venezuela now from Venezuela has got the message loud and clear, and is probably not going to want to end up in a jail cell in New York either, on literally trumped up charges. So,
we should talk about this whole idea about, intervention had hardly anything to do with democracy or human rights, and even less to do about drugs. I mean, there's a rule that I usually tell my students in the beginning of every semester, and one of them is that, listen, if you're going to lie, you need to lie convincingly. And the Trump regime just makes things up as they go along. Saddam Hussein had more weapons of mass destruction than Maduro had cocaine. It's going to be trumped up. It will be a kangaroo court. Perhaps Maduro is taking the fall. Perhaps he was unpopular among other members of his government, and they're happy to see him go. Perhaps we can find more cooperation from Rodriguez. We don't know, right? We honestly do not know. Perhaps this is nothing more than just a psyops for Trump, as a way of diverting attention away from domestic issues. The Epstein case is always looming in the background. There is rumors of another apparent government shutdown at the end of January. It could just simply be a display of force because this is what Trump does. We don't know. We honestly do not know. Obviously, he is mentioning a number of other countries within Latin America that need to watch their back. Mexico, Colombia, as well as Cuba. And let's not forget that this extends wider beyond Latin America to the possibility of the same thing with Iran. We also need to understand that, remember that a few days ago, Netanyahu came to the United States to have talks with Trump. Not a surprise. The Israeli government is absolutely in support of what Trump had done in Venezuela. And what this ultimately may lead to is the understanding that powerful states with the ability of doing certain things like this can absolutely be replicated among other countries with similar capabilities.
But Michael, if I might just interject on that. I think, again, we get into that very interesting thing. In the case of Iran, it would have to be a very different proposition. What are they proposing to do? Go in and arrest Pezeshkian? No, he's not the senior official. No. I think it would be, if they go in and try and arrest Khamenei, who is very old, yes, that would be quite something. What you just entering. So I think I think my immediate concern again is I think the fact that Rubio is refusing to rule out anything with Cuba. Cuba's been a really interesting position. The regime there is quite clearly crumbling. It's had real problems, but it's holding on. And maybe the United States just sees this now as a good opportunity. They've given it a test run in Venezuela, now saying to Cuba, you either change or we're going to do the same. But I think, is it Katie Miller, the wife of Stephen Miller?
Yes.
I don't know, Piotr, if you can pull that up. He posted a very, very inflammatory tweets
Stephen Miller or Katie Miller?
No, it's
Katie
Katie
Miller
Miller.
did.
It's Katie Miller. It's
Katie Miller, and she posted a picture of Greenland with the US flag imposed on it and just the word soon. So whether it was just high-level trolling, but this was really something that, absolutely outrageous. That
I would say a couple of things for that, which is that I've been working on a specific video about Cuba and was going to post it, and then this happened, so I now have to adjust the framing of that video.
Familiar story for all of us doing YouTube, isn't it?
The implications of this on Cuba are probably the most stark right now. I'm in Mexico, coming to you from the sphere of the world, which obviously shares the closest with Venezuela. And I was talking to some Mexicans. There's a few people on their last day before they go back to work in the Foreign Office here. And Claudia Sheinbaum is obviously, whether you agree with her ideology or approach or not, she's pragmatic. And we saw that, I think, pretty clearly when she took on Trump in the first few months around the tariffs, and quickly sort of Mexico fell out of the headlines or the eyesight, the focus of the Trump administration, because they largely complied. But she did it in a way that didn't damage Mexico too badly. Mexico's actually been growing quite well. People, while they don't necessarily like her domestic policies, have been largely supportive of her approach in foreign policy. But I do think that the situation in Cuba is the most precarious. The economy has contracted by about 15% in only a year, and the country was completely reliant, effectively, on Venezuelan oil. So for this now to be completely shut off, they have little to no source of energy at all. You've got constant blackouts. I remember being in Cuba a few years ago, and blackouts were part of the routine, but now they're almost semi-permanent. So I'm very fearful about the future of Cuba, and also because obviously what's interesting is Trump has effectively handed over administration of Venezuela to Rubio, and Rubio is partially Cuban, so he's going to be very keen on, I think, stepping forward to Cuba. I don't think anything is going to happen right now, but it's going to happen soon. Certainly in this year, you might see rumblings happening. But I think it's a personal project of Rubio, and of which I might add on a side point, how much is this doing for Rubio as a potential runner in 28 or something, right? This is positioning him to be quite a clear, he's certainly demonstrating his capacity to lead or be much more of an assertive authority figure. But yeah, I will see if I can find that quote. Is it Katie with an IE or with a Y?
IE, if I remember, KATIE, yeah.
Yes, it's effectively Greenland with the American flag. The entire geography is just the American flag.
Yes. Okay, I saw this as well. Yes, no, this was unsurprising. The last thing I would say just on Iran, from a military standpoint, I find it incredibly unlikely that you would see any operation that we saw in Venezuela happen in Iran. The topography, the logistics, it's much harder. It's much tougher to launch some kind of ground invasion, and it would be much more obvious. Iran is surrounded by countries that are more sympathetic to it. Russia's much closer, China's much closer. Not that they're going to get involved, but I think it's a world away for you to see a sort of operation of Venezuela's kind in Iran. I just don't see it. I think we're much more likely to see the Trump administration support the concurrent ongoing protests, which are getting deadlier and deadlier. But this is the post you meant, Michael?
Yes, that's the one. Yep, that's the one.
Okay.
I think we also need to, because we seem to be gravitating, and this is what naturally happens, right? We seem to be gravitating towards this whole idea of after Venezuela, is Cuba next, is Colombia next, is Iran. I mean, this is very much the same thing of, after Ukraine, are the Baltics next, is Poland next, is Kazakhstan next. I think that we have this tendency of overestimating the capabilities of great powers like the US and Russia. I need to emphasize this once again. We are still very much in the dark about what happens next. Trump can talk all he wants about controlling Venezuela's oil, which I mean, in a way, this is nothing new. I mean, this has nothing to do with making life better for Venezuelans. This has everything to do with the United States gaining control over the largest oil reserves in the world, and which I need to also add here. Someone in the comments had talked about how China also has an interest in oil in Guyana or gold in Guyana. This past August, China signed a 20-year contract with the Maduro government to buy 2 oil fields that will produce up to 60,000 barrels a day. So we need to understand that it's less to do with a horrible government in Venezuela and more to do with the idea that Venezuela is gravitating towards the BRICS world. And if Venezuela was to join BRICS, if Venezuela was to be part of the Russia, China, India coalition, this again is something that the United States will just simply refer to the Monroe Doctrine as illegal. It is amazing how one of the most egregiously bare and bold-faced documents of American imperialism is still referred to, chapter and verse, by both Republicans and Democrats as some kind of moral basis for intervening in the internal affairs of other countries. And it is also amazing how the Monroe Doctrine is used only when governments tend to be non-cooperative with the United States. Forget human rights, forget democratic transparency, forget the fact that there are countries in South America today that are run by far right-wing autocrats. This never, ever, ever comes into the debate when it comes to Washington, whether it's historically Pinochet in Chile, Milei today in Argentina, or the new guy that is running Chile. I mean, it's amazing how every time that there are elections in Latin America, it's either between a committed Marxist socialist or an unapologetic neo-Nazi. There's never anybody, in between. This never enters into the debate. It is all about economic interests. And I mean,
no values are only interests.
I mean, I've mentioned this already. I've mentioned this book already. But it's Overthrow by Stephen Kinzer is a book that everybody absolutely needs to read, because it documents, a history, a well-coordinated pattern of regime change, American-led regime change, starting with Hawaii all the way up to Iraq. And James, you mentioned Panama, Noriega. I think, what was that? 95?
1989.
89, yes, 1989. Yeah. I mean, the arrest of Noriega, who is still, in jail, regime change across Central America, also done under the auspices of some kind of, containing communism. This was a Cold War trope. But even before that, it was largely because these countries had denied major U.S. corporations, the United Fruit Company, the sugar plantation concerns in Hawaii. All of these things, basically, Venezuela, this is not unique to the Trump regime. This is effectively taken right out of the playbook of the U.S. State Department.
Well, there was a video on X which was of a gentleman. I think it got like 500,000 likes and sort of 20 million views or something. But he basically said, and this isn't me endorsing what has happened, but he said, well, if America won't do it, then what, you think Russia and China wouldn't have tried to interfere in our domestic affairs? Which I think was a pretty amusing. He was out on the streets celebrating it, and sort of one journalist sort of asked him, why are you celebrating? Doesn't this mean the US? And he's like, well, any great power might do it. And I think that's the point here, which is that even if America won't do it, someone else might. Again, that's not a defense of anyone doing it, but this is the world that we're in now of great power competition. Someone made the comment, I think most aptly, sort of, we are in a great power spheres of influence, and you have your dominant areas. I mean, we've said it in our own respective ways, right? And what I see here is a bit more of a broader strategy, which is that the US is effectively trying, or Trump more specifically, is effectively trying to systematically dismantle individual countries that are increasingly anti-America or opposed to America's sort of dominance, right? BRICS was going to see Venezuela join, and now you see Venezuela gone. Syria has disappeared. Are we going to see Iran sort of forcibly intervene by Trump to make it more aligned to the West? You know, is this part of some broader grand strategy to curtail China's anti-American alternative system, the BRICS-led system? I mean, that's getting a bit far ahead, perhaps, but you know, I'm sure, James, you've got.
Well, I think, to be honest, I think what Trump has done is just hastening the strengthening of the BRICS. I know that there will be a lot who will be sort of cheering this on, thinking this is a sign of US strength, but I would argue exactly the opposite. This is going to be encouraging a lot of countries to seek safety, you know, under a Chinese umbrella. I think that, you know, the trouble is that, you know, and there will be viewers who will laugh at what I'm about to say, but you know, this is wholly eroded what's left of US moral authority. Now, I mean, you know, again, there will be those who say, well, it's never had it or whatever. No, I think we can talk. I mean, you know, for a lot of those, I will always retort, well, give me the choice of, would you prefer to live under a liberal democratic system or not? That I think the vast majority of people on this planet would choose that they would like to live under a system that sort of respects their human rights and freedoms and gives them a say in how their countries are run. And I think, you know, we can point out all sorts of flaws in that. And, you know, and I think sort of viewed from a European perspective, there's a lot that we would say that is very, very wrong with the United States, especially at the moment. But I think that what has happened is that this is very clearly a move to great power politics, realpolitik of the 19th century. Yeah. And I think the great danger in all of this is that creates a hugely dangerous world, which will be far, far more prone to conflict and insecurity than the system that we had. And what I find, you know, particularly disturbing about everything that we've seen over the past sort of 36 to 48 hours is just the, you know, the horrifically tepid response that we've seen from Europe. They haven't called this out. They haven't said that, listen, we are living in a time when international law, you know, the rules-based order is under unprecedented threat. And this is a very, very serious blow to that is bringing it down just at a time when we really want to shore it up. Now, what I am going to say is to anyone, you know, again, there will be viewers out there saying, oh, your rules-based order, it never really existed. It was all sort of about controlling. No, it did exist, and it does exist, and it is incredibly successful. The international order that has been created since 1945, every day, thousands of actions are taken by countries which are fully in compliance with the rules, the order that they have created, the treaties that they have signed. We focus on the times it breaks down and catastrophically breaks down. But that is a minuscule fraction of the rules that have been created, which allow big and small countries to trade with each other, to run consular affairs with each other, you know, all sorts of different activities, you know, educational exchanges, scientific cooperation. You know, it's a whole system that's been created, which has been chipped away. And so you've got all these people who are laughing and sort of thinking, right, okay, we'll chuck another thing onto the bonfire. You know, we want to be done with it. No, this is not a world that I think any of us really seriously wants to be in. And it is very, very worrying. And as I say, the extent to which Europe isn't standing up for this, you know, and I can remember it wasn't so long ago that we talked about normative power Europe, how Europe's great strength on the world stage was that it respected international law and it presented a vision for how that rules-based order would operate. And we are just seeing quiet at the moment. I mean, you know, Starmer has been very tepid, and I concentrate on Starmer simply because he's a lawyer. You know, he more than anyone is meant to know the legalities of what we've just seen, but just saying, oh, well, we need some time to sort of look it over. I'm really pessimistic about, you know, and I think this is another blow to the system.
Let me add this, because we were talking the last time about once again, is this a moment for Europe to stand up? This was before the military intervention in Venezuela. Our last talk last year, we talked about, will Europe develop some autonomous voice apart from that of the United States? And the last 24 to 48 hours have proven no, they will not. probably the best and most typical response is from Ursula, who said, well, we're not in favor of going in and capturing a head of state. So it's a great way of distancing yourself from this action. But we hope that elections will, be, peaceful. So you are indirectly supporting this, as opposed to saying that, no, a head of state, regardless of whether we liked him or not, is the legitimate, head of government. So, whether it's Ursula or Kaya or whoever, I mean, very typical, very, very typical of them not wanting to ruffle too many feathers with the United States. And it shows what Trump has, I think, realized more than anything else at this is he can absolutely get away with it. He can absolutely get away with this. I mean, ultimately, I'm surprised he hadn't said this at his press conference, but it was implied. It was to the rest of the world, come at me, bro. Try to stop me.
I'm glad we brought up Europe, because it was something I really wanted to focus on for a moment. As you know, I'm pro-Europe. I believe it's Europe's moment in terms of seeking its strategic autonomy, in waking up to the realities of the world that we exist. And I think if we look at the comments, a lot of people are pretty passionate about this, because on the one hand, James, I think you would say that you're part of the older guard in the traditional rules-based post-45 or Second World War order, right? But that clearly just doesn't hold ground anymore. The Trump administration, let alone those that we more associate with this, like Russia and China, there is no interest anymore in all the principles or values-based order that we've been accustomed to, and in many ways have never fully held up, because it was the inconsistencies, the double standards that a lot of people have been so angry about towards the West's actions in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Panama. Many people question the legality of that. Just going in regime change, going in nation building, trying to forcibly impose democracy. And for me, Europe's response here is a reflection of a continent that just doesn't know what to do. We don't have the same military capacity to really do anything. And even if we did, we're not going to get involved on the other side of the world in Venezuela. And so what you have are these statements from the respective heads of state, which are sort of very carefully crafted, but frankly quite awkward, like von der Leyen saying that we have never supported Maduro's regime. So they're trying to sort of say that we are happy that the Venezuelan people have more choice now, but we also, in the second sentence, want this peaceful transition to adhere to the UN and international law and conventions that we've all been, we've joined, which is basically sort of saying we agree with the end result, but we don't agree with the means by which it's done, which is completely like listening to Starmer's interview. It was, I've had enough of him anyway. I'm very strongly opposed to Starmer now, but it's just pathetic. And I, again, like to believe, ignorantly perhaps, that Europe can still find a path forward on its own. But it's at moments like this where they just don't have anything. They have no capacity to influence the direction of policy or the great powers at all.
Can I just say, I mean, to agree absolutely with you, but I think where I worry is that this action and Europe's inability to speak out about it is just going to feed the view in large parts of the world which are looking on at the Ukraine war and saying, have been told by the West that this is illegal, or Europe telling them that it's illegal. Trump does this. And this is a complete violation of international law, and Europe doesn't come out strongly about it. This absolutely plays into Russia's hands as it tours Africa, tours Asia, and says, listen, the Ukraine war is a European issue. It's us, and it's about NATO. This is not about international law, because look what Trump is doing. He's violating international law, and those Europeans who are trying to persuade you that I'm a really bad guy for doing this, they're not speaking out against Trump. So they only stand up for international law when it suits them. So you know what? don't worry about getting involved in all of this. This is not your, this is not your fight. It creates a dangerous equivalence for much of the world. And we see it, all of us, we see it. Piotr, you see it on your channel. I see it on mine in the comments that come in. There is a real sense in the global south that a pox on both their houses. It's all hypocritical anyway. And that actually plays into Putin's hands more than anyone else, and to Xi's hands, because it's that apathy of just saying, we don't care about the rules-based order. And this is what really, really worries me. And I don't think that Europe understands that diplomatic political dimension of what we're seeing at the moment. This taking on Trump and challenging him, we aren't expecting, Europe to fight Venezuela's corner or anything like that. But if it doesn't speak out about it, it just feeds that narrative of hypocrisy that, the West just will stick up for its own, but it won't speak out. It isn't really about values. It's about its values when it wants to apply them, but no one else's. I think this is hugely, hugely damaging. But call me an old ideologue and sort of, a softy, believe in the international law.
I think that's where you and I differ, James, because I do think Europe would be slightly, or maybe I'm naively hoping it would be different over Ukraine, because it's much closer to home, and therefore the just sheer realities of that would mean that they wake up. But I think Europe needs to stop trying to preach and pretend that it can uphold or adhere to these principles that it's long expressed, because we just don't follow through on it. I think you're better off not saying it and then not enacting on it. Be pragmatic. Interests need to lead now more for Europe. And I don't like saying that, because I like to believe in international, relations and the UN and stuff. But I just think we need to, I've shifted much more towards a sort of principled realism in the past week alone, in sort of like, I want to believe in the principles that we like, democracy and all that. But Europe needs to wake up. We need to seriously.
We've been saying this since the 90s. We've been saying this since the 90s. I mean, Europe needed to wake up over Bosnia. They didn't. Europe needed to wake up over Kosovo. They didn't. Europe needed to wake up over everything in its own backyard. And the United States keeps saying to Europe, this is your backyard. This is your issue. They don't do something, the United States steps in. So, in this regard, it really seems like the people that are speaking on behalf of, first, the European Union, which I expected them to give these tepid responses. But even the heads of state are taking either a cautious, optimistic support for what Trump had done, or just simply saying, I was not involved. I was not brought into the discussion, which does nothing more than show that Starmer is probably one of the most irrelevant of all of the major leaders of Europe. So, we talk about this all the time, about when is the hour of Europe. Europe keeps missing its hour every single time.
But people would argue that, does Europe even have an hour, or was its hour,
that was the whole point. I mean, we love to talk about, again, the importance, the relevance. I mean, they're operating on legacy.
I do think there is one angle that the Europeans could leverage more. I don't know, James, if you have thoughts about this, but the EU has been trying to establish this this economic deal, this trade agreement with the Mercosur, the equivalent in South America for what, 30 years. Could the Europeans leverage that, or it's too unpredictable because of the military threats of the US now around there? I can't see how else the Europeans could do anything other than manage to deepen the economic integration with the Brazilians, with the Colombians, with Argentina, and so on. But otherwise, what can Europe really do to sort of have information of relevance?
No, you're right, Piotr. I mean, South America obviously is an interesting area, and these trade negotiations have been going on forever. But I think it's also important to remember that when we speak about the West, there are other actors. It's not just Europe and the United States. It is Canada, of course. You've got Australia, you've got New Zealand, you've got Japan, you've got South Korea, all of these elements. And I think, we can say that I think there is still a large enough coalition which is broadly aligned on things. But Europe was in a very, very powerful economic and political position to be taking the message about the need to respect international order to other parts of the world. So one of the ones that I've often brought up is Africa. We have done a terrible job of being able to explain to Africa what is happening in Ukraine, why it matters, why we need to protect the order. And I've often said this, that, I think Africa of all the areas is the one where you break down the rules-based international order, the fundamental principles of state sovereignty and things like that, and we will see chaos and death and destruction on an unprecedented level. And that will affect Europe very, very clearly. The mass migration that will come from conflict will, it will be coming towards Europe. Maybe the United States is more isolated from this, but Europe, has a vested interest. And we have seen, back in 2015, for example, the mass migration that was coming, from the war in Syria, from Afghanistan, and the chaos that caused. So, these are the things that Europe really needs to be paying attention to and trying to bolster that support. I just think that Europe, this is the story time and time again. We talked about it in the live stream a few days ago. The problem that Europe has is that it just cannot form a single political vision, of the level it really needs to, and then carry through with it. So we see this with Trump. Europe gets nervous, says, right, okay, we must do something about it. They managed to seemingly get Trump back into where they want him, and then they just breathe a sigh of relief, and that impetus disappears. And this was the live stream. So anyone who didn't watch the live stream a few days ago, go back and watch it. But it really, I think this is incredibly important. And I want to see Europe taking a much stronger stand on its own future and making that case, and not just Europe versus the United States and Russia, China for the world. But I think Europe can work with countries like Canada, can work with other partners around the world to be making a much stronger case of why we shouldn't be ditching the system and why we don't want to go into a great power sphere of influence type of 19th century realpolitik.
But do we have a choice? If that's the direction that countries that are much more powerful than Europe as a collective, or let alone singles, does Europe have a choice at this point? I personally am in favor of Europe revisiting the Convention on Human Rights, because I do think there needs to be a modernization of it. I do think there needs to be a revisement. Unfiltered, non-managed migration is a huge concern for Europe at the moment. And that's not coming from just working in Whitehall. It's also coming from working across Africa. And you hearing the relationship that a lot of Africans have towards Europe, especially, let alone the great powers, if you want to call them that, in Russia, China, and America. I think that Europe really needs to wake up to smell the roses around the opportunities that Africa has, but also the challenges it poses, and being much more assertive in determining what its own interests are, be that managing migration, be that securitizing its borders against Russia and Putin, be that against decoupling itself or de-risking at least from China, America, whoever. But these are not small scale singular issues. They're all integrated and big.
If I might, doesn't that make the case for Europe to act a lot smarter on this? In a world where you do have, China acting the way that it does. And I think many countries are very unhappy with the way that China operates. We can see that debt diplomacy and the way that that's functioned. It removes a lot of sovereignty from countries. We're now seeing the United States behaving in the way it is. We see Russia, many Central Asian countries will be very nervous about, Russia's behavior. Europe has the opportunity to present a very different model, that it's a cooperative model, that Europe isn't, Europe's had its era of colonial, and it was a disastrous era. Let's not make any, bones about that. It was horrific, the effect. But those European countries, Europe is now got an opportunity to say, look, we've moved into a very, very different sphere, of cooperation across Europe. We can show an example on this. We want to work with you. We're not going to dominate you in the way that, China, Russia, or the United States are aiming to do that. So actually, Europe has, again, a great idealist on this, but it's got an opportunity to present a vision of, a rules-based order which allows small countries to remain sovereign and work with each other in a cooperative economic way. So I think this is actually the moment that Europe should be stepping up and presenting a much clearer vision of autonomy for these countries through cooperation.
If that's going to happen, you need to do really one of two things. You either have to federalize the European Union, or you have to disband it altogether. One of the two. Because
I don't know how disbanding it. I think disbanding it would just lead us. That would be that.
Well, right. So then, in order to, we are talking about Europe needing a more unified foreign policy, a more unified, economic alternative. Whatever you mentioned Central Asia, so that obviously is something that's familiar to
well.
Me, right? Look, the EU, along with the United States, their presence in Central Asia is at best tertiary, behind that of Russia and China. They do succeed a lot when it comes to soft power, educational opportunities, especially as an alternative to the American educational system. With the biggest obstacle beyond that of visas is just the ridiculous tuition that is part of it. But this is it. This is effectively it. And if nothing else, it offers an opportunity for Central Asia's best and brightest to have a location for brain drain. I mean, that is ultimately it. But when we're talking about countries allowing to keep their own, let's say, sovereign decision making, this flies in the face of EU foreign policy, which forces members to march in lockstep with the EU Foreign Office. It forces countries that have not yet joined the EU, that want to join, to make very definitive decisions when it comes to one's relationship with Russia or Turkey or China in putting the EU first. If it involves sanctioning countries like Russia that directly affect their own economies, this is going to be seen. This is going to be vocalized by Eurosceptics, by national populists, by the Le Pens and the Fizos, and who else? I keep forgetting what's his name, Faranges. If he's even relevant at this point anymore. So I know, James, that you are the Europhile among the three of us. And all three of us, we want Europe to succeed. I agree with Piotr, on this as to whether, the hour has been, when is this hour of Europe finally going to happen? Not with this current gaggle of mediocre leadership that we have. It's not going to happen.
I think one thing, I wanted to say a couple of things on this because, I think it was Joseph Nye who emphasized the term of smart power. And for me, Europe needs to do a better job of reinventing its hard power. For people, if they don't know, smart power is the combination of soft and hard, and it's a bit more nuanced. And I think Europe has that capacity to leverage this. But how does it do that? And I think that for too long, Europe has been complacent. We've been too comfortable free riding off the US securities, the big markets, the cheap energy, etc. And so Europe needs to reduce its welfare states. We need to increase our defense. We need to harden. That doesn't mean that we necessarily ditch, to James's point about human rights and more of the sort of principled aspects. But we do need to damn well invest in more emphasis in areas that we may not like, but we have to. We have to play the game as it is, not as we'd like it to be. And right now we have a lot of leaders who are sort of saying things, but again, like I'll take the coalition as an example, coalition of the willing. When we had the coalition of the willing a year ago or never, after the extraordinary meeting between Zelensky and Trump, it was sort of, we've got a new German chancellor, we've got a sort of British prime minister, and we've got Macron. We're going to see this incredible unified coalition to step up against Russia and in favor of Ukraine. Okay, we've had sort of half a dozen meetings, some policy shifts, but it's still taking, I think, a lot longer than it should or needs to. And so, this is Europe knows what it needs to do. I think those who are, any of us watching this, any of us commenting now, we know what Europe should do, and I think that we can leverage our comparative advantages, the economy, our human capital, and engage with different communities. I like your idea, James and Michael, both, of Europe engaging much more, leveraging the fact that we do have Turkey. Turkey is very relevant in Central Asia. There are different angles that we can play this. Some people emphasize that because we're not a full federalized state, each country can technically play to its own relative part, but in the broader collective benefit of Europe. Again, that's a very idealistic scenario, but it's, there are options here. And I think Europe just needs to be a lot more willing to vocalize the hard things, to talk about the hard realities, which is cutting welfare. We do have too much money spent on certain things like welfare policy, and we need to be a lot tougher in terms of spending on defense. And that might mean that, Europeans aren't as cushy in their summer vacations, but ultimately we are readjusting to the realities of the world that we exist. Anyway.
But look, I mean, if I can say, I mean, and this, and I know this is a risk of sounding like a broken record, but again, I think where Brexit has had a terrible effect on for both Britain and Europe, because of course, Britain as a member of the European Union, one of its great strengths is it does have the Commonwealth now. I know a lot of people will laugh at it, but when Britain was part of the European Union, the fact that it was also a member of the Commonwealth gave it fantastic outreach, and a lot of countries would see the UK as their way of engaging with the European Union, and vice versa. This is, through Britain, the European Union had a much better, greater degree of access to, over 50 countries, which are part of the Commonwealth. And in many cases, it had in other ways, just as, rather the same way that the Francophonie, I mean, again, you can be skeptical about the value of these, but I think that they are important because they do provide another club, for countries, European former colonial powers, to reach out to these former colonies and say, on an equal basis, look, we want to be your voice in Europe. We want to represent you in those debates, and vice versa. And I think that, that was lost when Britain, left the European Union. So, Europe does, because of its colonial past, which, as I said, we've now moved beyond, but there is a heritage there that gives certain relationships between various European countries and much of the rest of the world. And Europe really needs to be so much more effective at leveraging that, and working it and coming up with that message. And again, we saw this 20 years ago, that there was this idea of normative power Europe. No one talks about that anymore. It seems to have disappeared. But I think if ever there was a time for Europe to be able to say, look, in a world which has been dominated by, powers that want to, that have very little respect for democratic freedoms, very little respect for human rights, are militaristic and are not afraid to use their armed forces to extend their power, or come in with very punitive terms like lending terms and things like that, Europe can present another model. Now, I know we've drifted off a little bit from Venezuela, but I think it is really important to be talking, at the moment about what Europe can do. But maybe, I mean, at this stage, to get back on track on Venezuela, what are we really talking about now? What are the next steps on all of this?
For Venezuela, for Latin America, for the world, for 2026, which topics here?
Well, I think, yeah, go on.
No, Piotr, I was just going to say, no, just as a steer, I mean, I think, where do we see this going now? What are the next things on the agenda? Not just for Venezuela, but, for US foreign policy, what do we need to be sort of keeping an eye out on?
Well, my focus right now, apart from the immediate fallouts for Maduro personally, are Iran. The situation in Iran is elevating, and I did kind of want to bring in Iran a little bit during the conversation, because I don't think many people are aware of just how tight-knit the Iranian-Venezuelan relationship, Maduro-Islamic Republic relationship was. The Iranians were very instrumental in providing intelligence, training. The Cubans were the ones who were the security services for Maduro. So there was this anti-Western or whatever peripheral group of countries that worked very much with Maduro's government, and the Islamic Republic would provide a lot of military training to parts of the Venezuelan government forces, and also Hezbollah, the proxy of Iran in Lebanon, was very active in Venezuela. The two signed a strategic partnership a few years ago. And so aside from the Russians, like the Wagner Group, sending in troops during the fallout of the 2018 election, China was there economically. But you did have this group of the core sort of axis, if you like, working quite a lot with Venezuela. So I'm quite focused on Venezuela, on Iran, and what this means for them. But also, obviously, I think the two main things to watch, if we're going to sort of say where could this happen next, it's Cuba and Greenland. Cuba definitely more likely. Mexico's not going to, you're not going to see US troops in Mexico. You might see Trump revisit the relationship with Mexico in getting more aggressive in terms of wanting to deal with the cartels, but he's not going to annex northern Mexico or something. I think it's more from an economic warfare standpoint. Cuba, on the other hand, really don't know. And Greenland, I'm most fearful about, because whilst Trump sort of joked about Canada, he isn't joking about Greenland. So that's what I would say.
Part of me would just, I would love to see a civil war within NATO. That would just be, that would be adorable. I would love to see Denmark invoking Article 5 against Trump and some, attempt at taking Greenland. I mean, on the realm of obscure, absurd possibilities, I mean, 2026, we're not even the first week in. So I'm not, discounting anything here.
I mean, I think the danger is, sorry, Michael, I think I worry about Greenland as well, because the reaction we've seen from Europe is, if Trump just does that and says, what are you going to do about it? If you take any action against us, we will tomorrow. We will withdraw all US troops from Europe. I mean, we will stop all aid to Ukraine. Don't you even think about doing anything. And what are you going to do?
I mean, this ultimately boils down to, rules-based order on one side and realpolitik on the other. I mean, at some point, is there going to be an outbreak of actual conflict, of open war? And is that the only thing that is going to get Trump to back down, or is that going to get the war hawkish MAGA Republicans to just simply escalate the violence? We constantly talk about how close we are to World War III. We also talked about in our last podcast whether or not we will see the type of conventional warfare that characterized World War I and II. I think, and I could be the doomer in all of this, I think we already are at war. I think the world is already at some kind of cyber warfare, informational warfare, economic, diplomatic warfare. We're not going to be seeing the types of large-scale battles that we, are accustomed to seeing here. But we've already looked at the way in which the United States has interfered in Venezuelan politics, largely, if not entirely, because of energy. I mean, that's ultimately what it is. With regards to Greenland, we can talk about whether or not the United States sees this as a military foothold, access to the Arctic energy. A friend of mine in a conversation a few days ago was sort of opined that if Trump has a foreign policy, it is ultimately neoliberalism in one state. I mean, that's just neoliberalism in one state. He talks about America first, but in order to make America first, it needs to secure energy resources within its surrounding areas. Hence, the controlling of it. We don't even know yet, how he's going to do this. All we have is just we've abducted Venezuela's president. We have not taken over the oil fields. There has not been any boots on the ground. There is just simple rhetoric, which is the reason why I'm saying it's too early to see what is happening right now. We are in that period between sort of that first and second Turkish invasion of Cyprus, where we're not exactly certain what's going to happen. Things could escalate. Things could absolutely escalate. This could be, as Piotr says, maybe the only thing. But if that's the case, then it doesn't do anything. It does not change any of the dynamics on the ground unless the United States is going to engage in clandestine information war for the next election in Venezuela. I don't see Trump being that patient, especially if it is now known that the United States is interfering in the internal affairs of other countries. Let's talk about Iran as well. There is clear dissension within Iranian youth. But that does not mean that they welcome American and, dare I even say, Israeli intervention. And the more that Netanyahu and Mike Pompeo and Mark Rubio say that we stand with the Iranian people, the more the Iranian government can turn this around by saying that the protests are effectively controlled from the outside. It's a typical tactic of how color revolutions operate. The worst thing that you could ever do if you are protesting against your unpopular government is to accept Western NGO aid, because that automatically now makes you out to be agents of another country. And so we have to be very, very, very careful about whether or not the United States or Israel is going to be conducting any further internal dissent within Iran, because anti-government protests in Iran does not automatically equate to being pro-Washington or being pro-Western. It is simply protesting an aging, crumbling regime that is still clinging to Islamic theocracy. That is ultimately what it boils down to, along with soaring energy costs. But that does not mean that the United States can simply interfere in the affairs of other countries and just simply think all they got to do is decapitate the leadership. And we can see pictures of people rejoicing. I don't want to see Venezuelans in New York and Miami rejoicing. I want to see Venezuelans in Caracas. And if that does not happen, we do not, please do not take the sentiment of the diaspora to be the sentiment of the people in the actual country.
No, but I think there is a fair amount of support or whatever, cautious optimism or cautious hope, Michael, within Venezuela itself, as there is in Iran. I think it's pretty clear that the ones with the biggest opinions will have the loudest voices, right? And the ones in Iran who are very pro-monarchy don't necessarily represent all or the biggest majority of those in Iran. Like in Venezuela, the ones that are pro-American sort of intervention or liberation, as they might call it, represent the majority of people who are more actually worried about the economic fallout for this, the instability it's going to cause, and so on. But I also think that at the end of the day, America intervenes, yes, but so does every country. There's not a defense of America, but the Chinese do intervene in their own respective way. The Russians intervene. What are they doing in Mali with the Wagner Group, with the Africa Corps? Yeah. Exactly the same. Every big player will interfere in their own respective way for their own respective interests. It's just America is the one that preaches about sovereignty and stuff, which is what pisses everyone off the most, because they say one thing and then do another. Which is why I think we should stop saying that. If we're not going to adhere, my core takeaway from all of this is, if we're not going to adhere to the principles that we're preaching, then stop saying them and just do it.
Which, I almost have to give Trump credit for being as honest as he is. He's not talking about democracy or human rights in Venezuela. He's just simply talking about retaking the oil industry. That's it. I mean, this has been a statement that John Bolton has been making for years on Fox News and others, right? There is a certain amount of just bold-faced honesty that is coming from Trump and Rubio and Lindsey. Lindsey Graham never misses an opportunity to brown nose and lick boot whenever he needs to. Pompeo, all of them have effectively said this is basically about oil. That's it.
Yeah, but I think the problem we're seeing here is very much the same problem, and I think the Venn diagram circles would intersect almost perfectly, and I know I'm about to say something which might seem a bit odd at first, but it's the anti-vax movement as well. It's the fact that vaccinations have been so successful that it's given rise to a section of community that just thinks we don't need them, they're dangerous. It's like, no, we need them. We have got to this stage today where we don't have to worry about these diseases precisely because it's been so successful. And I think we're seeing exactly the same with US foreign policy. We're seeing a cadre in the United States who says, we have a system that has created so much strength for the United States. We don't need these allies anymore. We don't need these organizations anymore. America first. When in actual fact, the very foundations of US leadership, the thing that has given it absolute strength, is this multilateralism and working with European partners. And, and again, I've said time and time again, Americans will say, oh, the Europeans, they never pulled their weight on defense. And Washington thanked its lucky stars under every other president that Europe didn't do that, because it kept Europe compliant. It meant that Europe was effectively a protectorate of the United States. And it meant that when Europe wasn't spending enough on defense, whenever it did spend on that defense, the Americans say, listen, we're providing the bulk of that defense. Your systems need to be interoperable with us. You need to buy American equipment. So Europe wasn't spending so much, but what it was spending was going straight into US, into the US. And the fact that US was providing that security umbrella meant that it had that unassailed leadership of the West, that it would go into things like the UN. And apart from certain issues like Iraq, which was highly divisive, on most things, it had that leadership position in NATO. And that's all been squandered because you have this group in the United States who are incapable of understanding the basis of US power. And again, this is why I think everything that we're seeing under the Trump administration is so utterly disastrous for the United States in long term, that it's going to weaken it. That the last thing that the United States would really want is to have a major Europe developing its own strategic autonomy that, stands apart. And, it's going to be really, the big question we've got is, we haven't even got past the first year of the Trump administration. We're not a quarter way there yet. Any following US leader, are we at a situation where things can't be rebuilt? Is there still any hope that you could see a US leader who would come in and sort of recognize that value of what American power was really built on, or whether Trump's going to continue this and there will be pushback? Because I think the other thing that we have to bear in mind is that South America today is not the South America of the 50s and the 60s. It's a lot bigger, in terms of economic strength, in terms of population. It's got other alternatives. It's not going to be cowed in quite the same way. And I think that this is something that the US is overlooking. So it can do what it did in Venezuela. But again, we come back to the fact, at another time, it would have been far more open in leading a coup and then having somebody there who was going to be avowedly pro-US. Do we know that that is going to be the case in this situation?
Well, I think, James, that's why it brings me back to this point about what can Europe leverage to have more relevance or role in Latin America more broadly. And I think that's where the economics of it, if Trump's going to be leveraging
exactly
military, air force, and hard power, even if the US economy is benefiting, but if he's going to be weaponizing so many aspects of it, as we've seen with the dollar ongoing, then Europe can offer itself as a more predictable. I mean, we have seen this. There's been a lot of capital flight from the US in the past few years. There's been reallocation of companies, relocating, to Europe. I'm not saying suddenly this is going to change America's global might, but Europe, I think, can certainly do more, which doesn't antagonize too much. And I think, some economic agreement with South America would be a wise initial step. And then we can talk about other things as we go. More cooperation between African Union and the EU. There are certainly things that can be done there, but the problem with all of this is if it does antagonize the Trump administration too much, what fallout does that lead for others? And ultimately, you get America being so antagonistic that it pushes Europe more and more towards sort of cooperating more with the Chinese, more with the Southern Asian quarters in India and blocks like that. It's incredibly unpredictable right now.
I mean, essentially, Piotr, we come down to the fact that it's Europe has got to find a way of tackling its Russia problem, because that really, at the moment, is the clear strategic military concern. But once you've got beyond that, I mean, I could see. I mean, look, I think it's always quite interesting, isn't it? The United States obviously views China as its main threat, whereas Europe views Russia. And I know that we could talk about the partnership between Russia and China, but I think Europe is by and large much more positively disposed towards China. And I suspect that Beijing, is there a clever way that Europe could be dealing with isolating Russia more effectively? and dealing with its problem by going to Beijing and saying, listen, we want to work more closely with you, but we can't, Russia we consider to be a real threat, and you're providing too much support for it.
I find that unrealistic though, because how are the Europeans going to isolate Russia when Trump wants to bring Russia back in? When Trump really wants to
that's exactly, this is why Europe needs to be doing far more strategic thinking on all of this. I can see a future for where Europe could actually replace the United States and present a very different model and be actually a far more powerful actor on the global stage by presenting a very different model of how you can do cooperative politics and in international relations, which Trump is hastening. I think that Trump really is weakening US power in all sorts of ways. The trouble is that Europe and other Western countries haven't worked out how to work with that and manage it and step in to replace it, not to become some sort of, follow the American model of power projection, but actually say, as again, sticking for the international rules-based order, saying, listen, we can all benefit from economic development. We can all benefit from a less militaristic approach to international relations and a more economic cooperative model. And we know that this is fundamentally the cornerstone of European development. This isn't just been idealistic. This is what has allowed all these countries of Europe, which have spent hundreds of years fighting each other, to come together and work together by economic interdependence. And that is a very alluring model. And to be able to present to the South Americans, look, why don't we work more closely with you economically? But in order to do that, in actual fact, one thing that comes out quite clearly is that you need things like rules-based order. The success of Europe is based on rules. It's based on the fact that all these different countries now cooperate much more closely with one another, legally, politically, so that that when you invest, if you're a Lithuanian company and you invest in Romania, you have got, there's a framework of laws that works in your favor. And it's doing the same with Africa, and Africa is open to this idea. It's, a lot of countries look to the European Union as a model they want to emulate. ASEAN is doing the same. Europe, I think there is a lot more there. And I think that what we're seeing Trump doing, playing to the Russia-China game, actually, if Europe could get its act together, would present a much more alluring model for the rest of the world.
Sure.
If we have this podcast in 20 years, you'll still be saying Europe needs to get its act together, James. I love you dearly.
I know. I mean, I'm not going to deny that for one moment. I mean, I remember in the 90s, you and I, we're old enough to remember politics in the 1990s. So Piotr, that was not a dig at you, but I think it was more sort of towards viewers who don't remember. But you're absolutely right. In the 1990s, the Americans were complaining about this. They were saying, who do we call them?
I like your offerings as well, and I'm not going to get too fixated on the word replace. Europe can't replace America, but they can offer a more constructive, predictable alternative.
That's exactly what I mean. It's not replacing America as the hegemon.
The key point about that I have is that this is where I am much more. Look, we can offer a more principled model based on rule of law, but that has to be internally applied. We can't go around anymore preaching about the rule of law and democracy if we're not going to be willing to sanction the US or treat every single country consistently. That is what pisses off a lot of people.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. But what Europe comes across as the world's gated community. Okay, it's the rich sections of London and New York that sit there and talk about what is to be done with the South Bronx in your, artisanal cupcake shop in Soho. What is to be done?
I mean, Michael, that I think is an unfair. I think Europe, the amount of aid that Europe gives to the rest of the world,
and says, look, we are a garden, we are a gated community, we operate on rules-based order, and the rest of there is Rome, and then there's Barbaria. And until the EU's leaders adopt the strategy, adopt the outlook that you predict, James, they are going to simply be insular. They are simply going to say, we will adopt rules-based order within our own little community of 27, 28, God knows when the next country is going to join the EU is going to happen. And that's it. I don't see them as successfully weaning China away from Russia. I don't see them as being this attractive market in Latin America when it's either American markets, Chinese markets, to a lesser extent, Russian markets. So in order for this to happen, the Ursulas, the Kayas, these other mediocrities need to either go away, or there needs to be a new generation of leadership within Europe that actually has an effing backbone.
But we come back to the fundamental problem.
Anybody in Europe right now that gives you any confidence that they are going to lead Europe into this utopian promised land.
But look, I mean, we come back to the point that we were making right from the start, is that, you know, what we have seen this weekend, I think, is actually weakening the US. It's another model, but the trouble is, and really, if I were to say what is the fundamental point of this conversation, it's to say that, you know, when Europe and the other Western countries cannot stand up to a violation of international law that we've just seen in Venezuela. And again, listen, you know, we've talked about Iran, we've talked about Venezuela. I do not care one jot for these regimes. I would love to see them disappear. But the fact of the matter is, when you do it in the way that the United States has just done it, you are just opening the door for that realpolitik of Russia to go into Ukraine and then tell the rest of the world, listen, America just does exactly the same. Why are you getting angry with us? Don't get angry with us. You know, they're just as hypocritical. Just leave us to it. It's our issue, not yours. Don't worry. We'll trade. We'll give you oil at a better price, whatever. This is what I find so disturbing. And this is what really, really worries me about the world that we're living in at the moment. So it's not about defending the Iranian regime or Venezuela. I'm happy to see Maduro gone in that sense, but I'm not happy at the way it was done, because I think it makes us all far, far less secure. And I think the fact that Europe isn't able to stand up to this and make that point and really understand in itself how damaging this is to Europe, that it's actually making Europe less secure as well. And it's cementing that sense that Europe is hypocritical, that it won't stand up. It talks about international law, rules-based order, but when push comes to shove, it won't do anything about it.
I agree with both of you. I think that Europe needs to look. I don't think it has to be too complicated. Europe can offer, as you said, James, or inferred, right, it can offer a more constructive, predictable alternative to the United States in an economic sense. But we also have to be a lot more willing to say the hard points, to talk about the uncomfortable truths. And that means that if Europe wants to be seen as a genuine upholder of this rules-based order, that they implement it consistently. I think that's what people would prefer to see. If you're going to talk about the actions of the United States and China and Russia as illegal or wrong, then you call them out, but not just China or Russia. You also call out the Americans.
Yeah, and they're not going to do that.
And they're not going to do that unless they pick up their conviction, unless they grow some balls and actually do that. I think the gated community analogy is very well placed. A lot of out of touch, very sort of champagne socialist kind of communities exist across Europe. And we need to be a lot more selfish in certain ways. I think Europe, we have been too busy trying to advocate for human rights and rule of law or other things in other parts of the world, that we haven't prioritized our own issues right now. A lot of Europe, especially some of the Western countries, are facing huge levels of poverty, huge levels of inequality, huge immigration concerns. And, you know, some people argue that this means the right-wing parties are going to come in and then dismantle the EU. Not necessarily, I don't think so. But if the EU is going to be the collective body by which the Europeans conduct themselves internationally, then we have to be a lot more coherent on what that looks like. And right now there is no consistency. You know, there's, just to bring one specific example, there's discussions of bringing in a Eurobond, right? These ideas of bringing in specific economic options for more investors, more people to look at. And if Europe wants to do that, then they need to stop being outraged and, to quote Macron, stop reacting to issues, especially over, say, Russia, Ukraine, and get out in front. They need to talk to Putin, as uncomfortable as it may be, because simply being angry about America going directly to Russia is not how you get relevancy and have a role. You have to play the game, and Europe has to play that game, because the uncomfortable truth is we're not in a world that adheres to what we assumed it did, well, when I was non-existent, in 1991. So anyway, that's my sort of preach. But bringing it back to Venezuela, and that means, I think, they should call out Trump's actions as completely unlawful. They should say that this is wrong. What does this mean for Venezuela? We are happy that the Venezuelan people have more choice, but the way that it was done is completely illegal and sets a completely unacceptable precedent now, and we do not stand for it. But they're not going to, and that's it's wrong. So what do we do?
For one reason, which we come back to, is that Europe's got to deal with its Russia problem, essentially. I mean, it can't do any, as long as it's reliant on the United States for security. It's not, to be realist about this, I understand it's not going to call out Trump. It lives in fear because it hasn't been dealing with this sort of US presidency in the past. I mean, to a degree, I think George Bush, but what was really interesting is that over Iraq, the divisions between Europe and the United States were very, very stark indeed. And I think it's very, it is forgotten now that, France and Germany were absolutely livid about what Bush was doing. They called it out. There was real fury about it. And remembering, of course, they had accepted Afghanistan, that they'd said, listen, we accept that Afghanistan, there was a legitimate case to go into Afghanistan, that the Taliban had provided an operations base for Al-Qaeda. It was supporting, this again comes up a lot on my channel. I'm sure it's the same with you guys. All these people saying Afghanistan was illegal. No, it wasn't. I think Afghanistan, by any understanding of the term, was a self-defense. It was a legitimate, legal.
It was legal.
It wasn't popular necessarily. I think people were much more.
Afghanistan was much more accepted. Afghanistan
absolutely.
Iraq was.
There was real anger about Iraq.
I'm actually really glad that you brought that up, because I remember leading up to the Second Gulf War. It was France that was the biggest dissenter within the room, and I remember, Dominique de Villepin, who was either France's foreign minister or the UN guy. I forget which one that he was.
He was No, de Villepin was the foreign minister.
And he was vilified in the United States. He was like public enemy number one. And Germany was number two. But the narrative that came out of this, and this was at the height of I don't know. You remember that movie Team America: World Police? It was the Matt.
Oh yeah.
Movie. I mean, it's a brilliant film. And I mean, just the French were just absolutely eviscerated within the first few moments of the movie. But that was the general sentiment at the time. And
what was it? Freedom fries, wasn't it?
How dare you go against what U.S. foreign policy? You're absolutely right about this. Europe had more of a backbone then than they do now. Yeah. They had much more of a back. And this was Donald Rumsfeld saying, okay, forget old Europe. Let's focus on new Europe instead, which is, the former Eastern Bloc countries. Forget France, forget Germany. Forget Spain was pro-invasion, and then there was a government change, and then who was it? Juan Zapatero came in, and he was also widely vilified in the United States. I would love to see that. I would absolutely love to see that at this point. We don't get it. We don't. When I mentioned, give me anybody in Europe that actually gives you some sense of optimism. There was a couple people in the comments section that was saying Macron. Yeah, okay. I mean, this is when you compare with everybody else. Sure, absolutely. But Macron is no Villepin. Macron is no Gerhard Schröder.
He's not a Charles.
Forget Charles de Gaulle. I mean, yeah, Macron can't hold a candle against de Gaulle. So I don't see the current leadership producing that kind of definitive break from American dependency. Europe is still very much trauma bonded to the idea that the United States, with the idea that maybe they're all thinking perhaps Trump is a blip. He's just a temporary inconvenience, and which everything will be back to normal again.
They are certainly holding out.
I think there was. I saw my comments thread that somebody, Mark C 5025, made a very good comment. Europe had a backbone because Bush wasn't aligned with Putin, and I think there was an element of that. You could have those fundamental debates because there was still an understanding that ultimately they were all on the same side. They were pursuing the same goal, and that's again where I think that Trump has, fundamentally misunderstood U.S. power. That it comes from having that network of international allies that you don't bully around, you don't kick into. That U.S. leadership was an element of having a strong military, but not a military that it was, not directly threatening Europe, but it was fully integrated. And I think that is what's gone. There is a real fear amongst Europeans at the moment that Trump ultimately, fundamentally, is more pro-Putin than more pro-Europe.
I think I've always been, well, this is why I've become a lot more realistic. I think the Europeans have been far too naive in thinking that America would ever do something that was in some purely idealistic sense, that they would act purely on altruistic means, right? America has always done things with self-interest in mind, whether it's first and foremost. And I think in this case, Trump is just being a lot more shameless in that, right? You can pretend whether Obama did it because he thought, no, he still did it because he thought it benefited America's grand strategy longer term. And I think Europe needs to damn well wake up to the fact that Trump is just doing that a lot more bluntly, and he's doing what he thinks benefits American self-interest. Europe needs to do the same. We need to decouple, de-risk, sanction, call out, whatever it is. If that's truly what we stand for, then we need to do it. And not stick around sort of hoping that a America led by Gavin Newsom will come around, or Kamala Harris, and somehow mean that the transatlantic relationship is the same as it ever was. Europe needs to wake up to the new realities that even if a more favorable leader does come in, that ultimately the precedent has been shifted. The precedent has changed, and Europe needs to be a lot more self-sufficient, willing to go its own way in what it thinks over domestic international issues, etc. Not just kowtowing to what DC says, because it doesn't work like that. And I'm a lot more cynical on this than other things. I want to believe in that transatlantic relationship, but we've got another 3 years to what James says, and Europe has 3 years to wake up. Or it has, well, maybe less actually, but you know what I mean. It's going to take time. Let's pretend that we assume Europe is going to be more proactive in seeking its autonomy and leadership, whatever. That's not going to happen overnight. It takes time to decouple, to reindustrialize, to build your capacity to manage it on its own. So I don't think you'd see European leaders being so critical of Trump yet, but maybe over time, if they're doing things behind the scenes, that may change. But I mean, this is a lot of speculation.
Well, I guess also if they decouple from the United States, I mean, are they able to go alone? Or do they have to recouple with another power? China, even Russia, for that matter.
I don't know. I'm not sure about that.
Well, look, that's not going to happen anytime soon. But, you know, we can talk about what Europe can and won't do, what they should do. But I think that, I mean, I am, at this point, I'm much more realistic with Piotr, in that I don't have any hopes that this is going to happen anytime soon, not with the current leadership, and not with the way in which they see themselves vis-a-vis the rest of the world, especially when there's a couple of other things. And I know that we're now almost approaching 2 hours, and there's this one particular topic that we can talk about maybe at another time, but it's also the role of narrative. It's the role of information. The war in Iraq 20 plus years ago happened before social media. Information was still largely controlled by big corporate media giants. Social media today is, it's a blessing and a curse, because it can spew conspiracy theories, and it can also boldly call the emperor naked for having no clothes. a lot of what we see happening, particularly with American foreign policy, with the incredibly, what we call this, besieged philosophy of liberalism, international relations liberalism, rules-based order and such, is criticized on a daily basis within social media circles. Telegram being probably one of the widest ones that will poke holes in the morality that the West likes to portray itself as. We talk about Europe needing to adhere to the rule of law while it does everything possible to stifle any dissent within the EU against the state of Israel. And I'm not bringing Israel up now, but I mean, you talk about, morality, you talk about justice, you talk about legality. It needs to be, Piotr, as you rightly say, it needs to be uniform. But that means that there is going to be a lot of internal soul searching on the part of the decisions of many of these leaders, both at the national and at the international level. Given what has happened in Venezuela, and I know that this is now going to be a major talking point in forthcoming press conferences and statements coming out of the Kremlin, specifically Putin, but even more so Lavrov. They talk about this stuff all the time. Lavrov has a number of talking points within his narrative that really describes the way in which Russian foreign policy views itself, justifies its actions. And yes, it will, as James, you pointed out, it will use this as a lightning rod to show that the West does not suffer any kind of non-compliant government. And this should be seen as a wake-up call to countries like Iran, Brazil, Colombia, and Cuba to close ranks within BRICS countries, and maybe even talk about BRICS developing some kind of defensive strategy as well. A lot of things can happen. A lot of things can happen in the next couple of months.
I mean, BRICS has a lot of things it has to sort out. It's just lost an aspiring member. It has no real coordinated mandate. It is more of a sort of gang of countries that collectively meet once a year to talk about their shared interests or, discontent with the US, which is growing. You're seeing more bilateral exchange, but it has a long way to go. And if you're going to start seeing it shift from just an economic forum to a sort of defense alliance, that's going to take a lot of development, a lot of policy shifts, which in some ways, I'm not sure which countries have that appetite. The Chinese, are doing things, but it's always covert with the Chinese. They're not very vocal about what they're doing when they disrupt things with the Filipinos. It's often behind guise of all sorts of sort of fog of war. When they're talking about Taiwan, it's very subtle. And that's another thing we haven't even talked about, actually. Whilst all this stuff was going on in Iran and other parts of the world, the Chinese were conducting military exercises off Taiwan.
Massive.
Yes,
yep.
Right outside of Taiwan. Yep.
We haven't even talked about that.
There is a real concern. I mean, it was very noticeable, with how much international coverage, but Xi Jinping in his New Year's address essentially said that, the unification of Taiwan and China is unstoppable, to use his words.
Yeah,
and we knew that 2027 is the target that the Chinese have given themselves for their military modernization in order to be able to take Taiwan. I think that there is, that has got to now be a very, very real concern. And it doesn't, again, it doesn't necessarily have to be a full-scale invasion, but we could see a blockade. And what happens then? So I think this is all incredibly it is worrying times, but at the same time I do think that there are a small group of countries which we cede great power status to, and I do genuinely think that Europe can present a different model to that. But, and I keep making this point, it's got to deal with its Russia problem first, because I think that is the security. We can't talk about an international system that works on sort of international law again and things like that. And I don't think it's completely gone. I think, again, I make this point, the vast majority of international interactions are still based on treaties, on international law. And I think most countries want to keep that in place. They don't want to return to a world where, big countries like the United States can just simply rip up the rule book and impose tariffs left, right, and center. To this week, we're going to impose 80% tariffs. Next week, we'll drop it down to 20, but then we'll put it up to 120, completely erratic, going in, seizing their leaders and things like that. I don't think countries want this. I don't think they want this system.
Well, that's when I often bring in Africa. From my time living out there, I can say that some of the biggest upholders of the system that we've been accustomed to are African nations.
Absolutely.
Because they came very much to the realization that, okay, this is the hand we've been dealt. These are the new borderlines that we have. We live in a sort of Westphalian nation state kind of system now. We've got to make it work. And whilst it's not exactly easy with Sudan's civil war, with this situation in DRC, with Somaliland now being recognized by Israel, all these things show that actually it's some of the poorest nations that are the biggest upholders of the international law, which, as in the most purest of form that you're talking about, James. And so therefore,
and we aren't selling them the reality of why that's worth preserving and what is the model to do it.
That's an opportunity for Europe, therefore,
to work with that, which is the point I've been absolutely making. If there's one takeaway message in all of this, that's it. That Europe can say there are a lot of countries. There's 193 members of the United Nations. Most of them, the vast majority of them, would be happy to live, where there is a stability. The sovereignty will matter. A lot of them won't want any outside meddling in their internal affairs. But given the choice of a stable international order based on international law, where they know how things work, and there's a degree of security and stability there. That's what they'll take.
Again, I think this is all very idealistic, and I think we have to be realistic.
I don't know if it is so idealistic. I think, as I say, I think there's receptive audiences out there. But I think the point that you were making about BRICS is very valid. BRICS, I don't take BRICS particularly seriously because I think it's just a coalition of countries that like to complain about the West. But there is very little that ties them together in terms of ideology, in terms of outlook, and again, where is this going in terms of economic cooperation? Economic cooperation relies on an understanding of rules of law, that you want to be sure that when you enter into contracts, that when you enter into system, that there is some arbitration mechanism available there, that these are countries that if you want to invest, if you're an Ethiopian company and you want to invest in Iran, you know that the law is going to be on your side. This is where Europe made the understanding and where it's so successful. None of that exists in the BRICS because the one thing that we know is that autocratic countries do not have that sort of legal system in place because it's very arbitrary. It has to be arbitrary because you need to have that in order to just chuck people in jail at will. So, it actually all does tie in with each other, believe it or not.
I think it's a long-term
absolutely
strive for, but as it stands right now, Europe is not in that position. It has to focus on its own house, right? It has to be much clearer on what it is it wants to achieve, how it wants to achieve it, what its boundaries are, how far it's willing to go before it can then begin to really leverage its advantages, if it has them, to engage African states in that way. The same with Latin America through a free trade agreement or something. Right now, Europe is so inconsistent, and well, we said it enough, I think. To see this, sure, in some long-term idealistic scenario, yeah, absolutely. But I'm very skeptical of how realistic it is. But Michael, I'm sure you disagree on, or I don't know, you probably might see it differently.
I mean, I wouldn't. I guess out of the three of us, I'm the one that probably gives BRICS much more benefit of the doubt than you do. And I could be wrong. I could be wrong. Look, I could be wrong. I don't have any gift of foresight here, but I do know that the number of countries joining BRICS, either as permanent members or as partner members, is growing. And what this implies is that at some point there needs to be some kind of organization. There needs to be more institutional structure,
I don't think it'll happen.
To just, but you know what? If it doesn't happen a year from now, fine. And if it does, something tells me, again, I could be wrong, but something tells me that what happened in Venezuela, because we have to remember, the original topic was on Venezuela, and we spent almost an hour talking about how awesome Europe could possibly be. I don't know how or why, but we just did. Okay. But this could be a wake-up call to other countries to say that we need more than just simply economic agreements. We need closer geostrategic alliances to prevent the type of Western-imposed regime change. That's why I'm saying
American-imposed regime change.
American-imposed,
that's the thing. And the danger is that Europe gets tied up.
Because it's America, but the West sits by and says, well, we weren't part of this, but we just hope that elections and the rule of... It's like, look, where I'm from, I'm from this little state called New Jersey. The speed limit is 55 on the highway. And the general understanding among the herd mentality is that if everybody goes 85, the cops can't pull us all over. And I think that that's a wonderful thing, So if we all just simply say, well, if everybody drove the speed limit, yeah, we don't. Oh, if everybody just, paid the fare on the subway, and we find new and intricate ways of hopping the turnstiles or opening up the emergency exits. We talk about rules-based order in a world run and dictated by people like Trump, who basically say, I can do what I want. What are you going to do? Come after me.
Well, he's actually, I'm just saying.
And Europe sits by and just simply says, well, at the end of the day, Maduro was a bad guy anyway. So, loose,
I agree with you.
It's all fine.
I don't know what the BRICS will achieve. I really don't. I can't see.
I don't either. But what I do see is that there are
more countries lining up to join it. That's absolutely the point. That again, that was one I made at the start. Was that I think the danger is that the US actions in this are strengthening the BRICS, such as it might be in strengthening in the sense that more countries want to join, which is a greater coalition against the United States ultimately, because that's what the BRICS is really aimed at.
Sure.
It's not aimed at Europe.
And as long as you have a scenario like Venezuela, that ties the narrative.
That is absolutely the danger in all of this. But again, I don't know where the BRICS are going to, but every country that wants to sign up with the BRICS is another country that has turned its back on the US. And so US power is weakening in all of this.
Yep.
I think
the US playing the realpolitik game is just utterly, it's doing anything but strengthening US power. So it can have these little shows of arresting, leaders like this and thinking that it's, rah, 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 it's done, and Hegseth will be completely over the moon about this, but
I think that, well, look, I've just seen on the Atlantic, Trump has already threatened Delcy Rodriguez, so the current acting president of Venezuela. He said that she will meet a fate worse than Maduro's unless she complies with US wishes. So much for Europe's calls for a peaceful, democratic, free transition. I think that demonstrates that, again, Michael, I agree with you about this, but what I try to shift is from simply criticizing Europe for all its, things that you said, to sort of like, okay, how do we actually make Europe change? How do we shift it from a problems issue to a solutions one? Because I think we know all the issues that are with Europe, but how do they then actually resolve those hypocrisies? As for BRICS, strategically, I've always been skeptical. I think that it isn't something that has, as I say, it's been around 15 years as a physical entity, but what is it going to do more than tactically, where I'm a little bit more convinced, because we have seen some policy movements, we've seen some bilateral agreements established, a reduction of the US dollar in certain contexts, but again, that's a lot of that is bilaterally. So what is the organization as a whole really going to do strategically to offer an alternative? I think that's where I'm still more skeptical of it. But I guess, to bring it back round to next steps with Venezuela, things are changing very fast. We are seeing these threats now from Trump. And my worry is that we're going to see an internal instability in Venezuela. This leadership isn't going to comply with America. What's that going to do for America's actions over the incumbent replacements, and what's that going to mean for the opposition? Is Trump suddenly going to bring Maria Machado back in as a sort of relevant actor, or what does this all mean for the Venezuelan people on the ground?
That's why I said we're in that middle interim period between the first and the second Cypriot invasion.
And we come back to the point at the start, which is, boots on the ground is messy. It was never going to be a realistic prospect. And unless you've got boots on the ground there, you can't ultimately dictate what's going to happen. This is can it really, all right, it might try and sort of take off the next Venezuelan leader, and what happens when are you going to be able to stop fixing the elections? How? It's a huge thing. It really, and I just don't get it. And look, I'm really reminded of Iraq, and Iraq was, oh my God, I was tossing up between shitfest and fuck up.
Yeah,
well, both words come into it. But the thing I would say is that for those who can remember, Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney were serious people. They were evil. They were really, really evil, but they were serious people. And look at the mess they made. And look at the utter mess that they made.
But then again, we need to understand, this is what happens when the Pentagon takes over a country, not the State Department. Colin Powell was completely and utterly sidelined by this.
Yeah, no, fair enough. But
another thing is that what was secured in Iraq beyond the green zone, the oil fields. We need to remember this has nothing to do with democracy. This has nothing to do with the rule of law. This has nothing to do with drugs. This has everything to do with seizing a country's vast.
Yeah, but Michael, but it's worth bearing in mind. You seize the country, you seize this. If you don't put in place those strong political structures, which are going to be more positively disposed towards you, you will fight a losing battle. And that was where Iraq went so badly, that they didn't understand how to co-opt the leadership that had been there and say, listen, we got rid of Saddam Hussein. We're going to co-opt the Ba'ath members. We're not going to sack them all and everything. It was a colossal mistake. It
Absolutely.
was. But the thing is, the point I was making is that, we were dealing with, Bush wasn't a serious figure. We know that. But we were dealing with people who around him were hugely experienced. And as I say, evil geniuses in many ways. But they made such a horrific mess of what happened in Iraq. And then just comparing that with the sycophants that Trump has surrounded himself with. There's no one of that sort of caliber. That Hegseth is not a Rumsfeld. That much is clear. Vance is not a Cheney. This is where I think
the best they have is Rubio. The best they have in the context of Latin America.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, and Hegseth can help us with that because he's an ideologue. He has a crusading mission. He has a crusading mission to decommunize Cuba. We forget about Afghanistan. 20 years we were there. The Taliban took the country back. The Taliban took the country back in as many days as we were there in years. But this is the thing:
remembering, of course, Trump had effectively surrendered to them.
Sure, but we don't play the long game, right? We're very good at decapitating leadership, and then we spend the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years trying to keep the country from collapsing until we finally give up. And we retroactively say that we either A, we accomplished our initial mission, or B, well, they don't really believe in democracy and they hate freedom and they just hate America anyway. So, there it is. Again, Stephen Kinzer's book, Overthrow. This is exactly it. There's not a single country outside of World War II that we have intervened in and made it a functioning democracy.
Yeah.
Okay. No.
Okay.
And on that happy note.
And with that, we are back to where we started. not knowing what to do at all. No, I mean, I've taken away a lot from this conversation. It's certainly helped to refine some of my questions and things that I wasn't really sure what I felt about or how I felt about it. But now, again, as a European, I come at this from sort of what Europe should do, what it will likely do.
Yeah.
But also just for Venezuela, I mean, at the moment, this isn't, as I said at the beginning, this isn't going to be a conventional nation state building exercise. It's not Afghanistan or Iraq. Venezuela is purely in America's sphere of influence. And, no country's going to go in there and try to stop what the Trump administration are planning to do, which is 100% administer the country. And meanwhile, they'll be looking elsewhere at Greenland, at Cuba, most certainly. And it's sort of almost like we have a caretaker president. We have a caretaker leader who isn't even on the ground in the form of Rubio. And ultimately, you're going to get a more corporatist Venezuela coming out of this with Chevron managing stuff. You're going to get other companies coming in, perhaps. But ultimately, this also depends on what the internal political struggle is between the opposition, whoever that is right now, and also Trump's continued threats on the remnants of Maduro's government. And then, of course, we could say how is this transported, how is this exported to Iran and other countries in the sights of the Trump administration. And we're all having to just sort of ride the wave of realpolitik versus countries or groups that think we're in a rules-based order, which, well, I don't know if we are anymore. But still, I don't know, gentlemen, if you have closing remarks or anything like that, maybe because we're at 2 hours 10, and I think
I think we probably said, well, I mean, we weren't expecting to do this, but it was, I think, all of us yesterday, suddenly seeing this news and thinking this, I would just simply say, I guess, at the end that, to my mind, this is the most serious development of the Trump administration on foreign policy, at least. And that's up against stiff competition, because I think this really does set a very, very dangerous step. A lot of talk up till now. I think bombing Iran was obviously an extremely serious move, but that took place within the context of a major conflict taking place between Iran and Israel, where there was a lot of bombing going on anyway. That's not to diminish what happened, all the damage that was being done, but I think that this really does stand apart in terms of a major step, and also the fact that it does seem to, this is very clearly the most significant move towards a realization of this idea that Trump has of a new Monroe Doctrine for the Western Hemisphere. This is, there's been a lot of talk about this so far with Greenland, with Panama, with Mexico, Cuba, but this is that first potential big step. And the fact that now we're seeing, the wife of the deputy chief of staff, who is incredibly influential, we know, in the Trump White House, saying soon over a map of Greenland, and Rubio refusing to rule out Cuba. I think this is very, very worrying, and the fact that Europe has been so tepid, and that will have sent a message to the Trump administration. Europe's weak; they won't stand up to us. Mm-hmm. And then what happens? What happens if Greenland? I mean, I dread to think the implications of a step in Greenland, or maybe it will absolutely be that damp squib that the Danish will be furious about it. And the rest of Europe will say, but we can't really do anything because we need to keep Trump on side for Ukraine. So you could, in that situation, I could definitely see Denmark withdrawing from NATO.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we need to sacrifice Denmark's territorial integrity in order to uphold Ukraine's.
Absolutely.
I mean,
put nicely. Very much so.
I think that. I mean, this was. You all saw Trump's press conference yesterday with Rubio, Hegseth, among others. I mean, in addition to, this was a display of, just once again, just sort of creating this unified circle of leaders. It is Trump producing a hit list of countries that are on the potential chopping block. Colombia, Cuba, Mexico, perhaps, Greenland, Iran. These are just 5 that now Trump has effectively said to the world, this is what I'm committed to. Now he either has to put up or he has to shut up. And the thing with Trump is that he talks a lot. Does he follow through on any of these? It remains to be seen. We still have 3 more years of Trump's presidency. And that's not to say that it's going to be over after 3 years. He could be succeeded by Vance. He could be succeeded by Rubio. This could be a whole new, ideology coming out of my country. But it is a bold claim to say that the United States is going to do exactly what it wants. It has, at this stage of the game, one key international partner in all of this. Its major strategic partner in the Middle East that is absolutely walking in lockstep.
We stop right there because I know where this is going.
No, that's the end. That's it. I mean, this is kind of like, welcome to 2026.
My takeaways are that simply Trump is, I think, systematically undertaking a gradual dismantling of certain countries that adhere to this anti-US order or who are more seeking this sort of idea of multipolarity. I think it's quite clear since Syria as well that he wants to target any country that has a dissenting view, any government that has a dissenting view of America. And he's going to do whatever it takes to do that. Cuba, I think, is quite possible. I don't think it would happen in the next week or something, but certainly this year you could see some developments around that. Greenland, I think your scenario, James, is very plausible. I think it's very plausible that Europe basically kowtows to Trump's forced acquisition of Greenland. But ultimately, I think it may be in a few years, depending. I think it also depends heavily whether Europe decides to hold out for a more favorable leadership, or whether in the 29 election or whenever it was, that we sort of see Vance running against Gavin Newsom. Is that going to be the ticket? Let's say then we get Vance. That's a scary thought because he's in some ways even worse than Trump. But let's say that Gavin Newsom or someone more favorable, more conventional towards what Europe thinks of America wins. Then you would sort of see, I think, Greenland eventually returned to Denmark. But at that point, they would just use it as an opportunity to seek independence. So either way, you would see if moves were made on Greenland, I think is what I'm saying, then Denmark would certainly lose it. And lose it. Or you would see Greenland independence. Yeah, lose it. Okay, so but other than that, I mean, my main concerns now are what happens in Venezuela and the fallout that has for other groups in, say, Iran and Cuba, and this just broader grand strategic narrative around, realpolitik versus rules based. I don't think it's quite as binary as that, but that's sort of how we can summarize it. And of course, in all of this, where Europe sits, is it going to follow through? If it's not, then it needs to shut up. And if it is, then it needs to start taking a stand more consistently and actually doing. But I think the focus is on Venezuela right now. And what happens, I mean, based on the news feed that I'm getting, it's not even sort of days, it's minutes. We're seeing updates about what's happening with Maduro, and obviously all of this under the guise that it was a terrorist organization and the dismantling because it was legal from a national security standpoint and drug enforcement for the US, which what China can go into Taiwan because it's an illegal support. They're worried about the semiconductors. That's disrupting their energy networks in southern China. Or something, but all right. Thank you very much, everyone, for watching. We will see you next couple of weeks. I mean, at this rate, maybe we should just be meeting on a weekly basis to cover things. And
I appreciate the impromptu meeting that we all threw together within the last 24 hours. But it was needed.
This was just too big to ignore.
Yeah, no, it was.
I think we all did. I think we all did a great job because we have all collectively gotten praise and condemnation from everybody.
Oh yeah,
things in the comments.
we talked over each other a bit, but I think it's more about the highly charged nature of what we're talking about, and we all want to sort of just jump in with what we think, oh shit, it's going to happen, and then it gets a bit carried away. So apologies for my interjections at the beginning there if it was a bit hot-headed, but I think it's just we're all scrambling to make sense of what is going on and who's right or who's wrong, and what should best happen and what's more likely to happen. But with that, everyone, do check out these gentlemen's channels. They are amazing. Do follow us on other platforms if you like to use them. And
don't do Twitter, X. Don't, please. Sorry, I know that you've stuck with it, but
hey, it's still in the rules-based order or realpolitik. X is still the place where announcements.
It's realpolitik. It's not rules-based order. Given everything that's come out about Twitter X in the past couple of days.
Right. Well, yeah. All right, gentlemen.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. Thank you very much for watching. We shall see you on the other side.
Stay
Bye
safe.
there all. Thank you very much.